Hey everyone, and welcome to the Joomla Shack conference. I'm Steve Burge, your host for this 3-day event. I'm delighted to welcome Vic Drover to this session. Vic has been a good friend for many years. He's been a volunteer with me in the Joomla organization. He's been a business partner. We were hanging out just last week at an event, and he's going to do a great job with this presentation. Vic runs Watchful, which is a security, site maintenance, and update tool for Joomla sites, specifically focused on agencies. And Vic is going to talk about the best practices for agencies to keep multiple Joomla sites safe. Vic, welcome.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate it, and welcome everyone else to the call. Glad to have you in, and Steve, thanks for putting this conference together. It's really great. Well, everyone, thank you for attending this talk on security best practices, again, as Steve said, for agencies. We've got a fair bit to cover here, I think. I'm going to try and go through it without speaking too quickly, which is my habit. So if you find me going a little too quickly, please just pop into the chat and let Steve know, and he'll let me know. All right, so I had this talk originally with a whole lot of security problems and big issues, but I pared it down, and I just thought I'd start with this kind of classic massive hack from 2016, the Panama Papers. I'm not going to really dig into it too much, except to say that at the time it was one of the largest data breaches in history. I believe at the time it was the largest, tens of millions of files, over 2 terabytes of data. And I think 400 journalists from all over the world kind of cracked in and dug into this case. Importantly, the issue was related or suspected that there was this huge data dump resulted from either an outdated version of WordPress or an outdated version of Drupal, 2 content management systems that I'm sure you're all familiar with. But it's not just, of course, these softwares that are vulnerable and targets by hackers all over the world. Joomla has had certainly its large share of security issues. And as a matter of fact, the reason I moved my career from science, where I trained for a long time, into software was because a tool I was using for a sports website had a security vulnerability in it that was unpatched, and the developer had left, and I kind of picked it up to try and keep it secure and useful, and that was how I started in this area. A large or well-known Joomla-related hack from 2016 is shown here on the screen, where Joomla was implicated in the loss of data regarding patient information, cancer patients in this case. So Joomla was suspected. But those are a couple older examples. There are 0 days published all the time for open source content management systems. And exactly 1 month ago, there was this proof of concept published for an older Joomla version. So new Joomla versions weren't susceptible. But this just shows you that people are always trying to find ways in. And sometimes finding a vulnerability in an old version helps hackers get into and penetrate newer versions. So we should always be on the lookout for such things. The Joomla extensions directory, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but for those that are not, this is the area in Joomla where people go to get extensions and look at reviews and determine which tools are best for their problem they're trying to solve online. And that actual server, the Joomla extension directory server, had a data intrusion or data breach just this past year. And there was a follow-up done in May. And it turns out that one of the underlying softwares on the server, so not Joomla itself, but one of those underlying softwares had a vulnerability. And importantly, it was unpatched because the hosting company thought the Joomla project was taking care of this piece of software, and the Joomla project thought the hosting company was taking care of this piece of software. And as a result, there was this data breach. So if you want to maximize security in any organization, and I'm most interested in agencies, I have my own web agency, of course, and I know many developers and friends and colleagues with web agencies, you need to look at all kinds of sources of risk, from the software you're using to the people you're interacting with and the tools that you're using at all levels. So to discuss this in a way that kind of makes some sense, I put together what I call this kind of security pyramid. Basically, there are 3 levels, and big or small, 1 person or 100 people in your agency, this kind of pyramid can give you some structure that you can use at your own agency, maybe you have a one-person shop, maybe you have a 10-person shop, or maybe you're in a giant conglomerate. You can present this to either the owners or your colleagues to help address and discuss security issues at your agency that are going to improve security for the products and services that you're delivering. Specifically, we're talking about websites, of course. Okay, so I'm going to first look at what I think of as the underlying level of security here, the agency workflows and policies. That's where we'll start. We'll move on to the servers and services that you use when you're building and delivering websites, and then the actual end user software, Joomla, for example, that the people are interacting with once the project gets delivered. So let's start, as I said, at the bottom. We're going to look at the agencies, this base of the pyramid. This represents your internal policies and workflows. Okay, especially with one-person agencies or new developers who are really focused on learning the technical side of Joomla and web development, it's easy to overlook the agency side. Usually most companies go back and look back after they've got some success, they've got some clients, they have a minute to breathe, then they go back and look at their agency workflows and policies. So if you're new, pay attention to this part now. You may not deal with it right now, but as you're developing your tools and skill sets, you can keep this in mind and you can come back and figure out a good workflow that's going to give you security. So let's dig into that and find some ways to make security part of your corporate culture. So the building block of any web agency, in my opinion, is the trust that a client bestows upon you as their developer or on your agency as the development agency. A client trusts your agency to deliver a website and online services, but it goes beyond that. The client is usually trusting your agency with a number of sensitive access credentials. Probably the biggest elephant on this list is access to the server. So either terminal access via SSH or cPanel access via a browser. Additionally, you might also have access to a variety of service providers, such as those for transactional email, SSL certificates, contact relation managers, and registrars. And the list really goes on in today's modern web development world. And because you're having all these credentials to very sensitive, high-level tools, then it's really important that you have good password security for your agency on behalf of your clients, of course. You have to maintain that trust with your client if you want to be successful. So you need to keep these passwords in a secure location. You have to have excellent access control so that if you're working in a team that you can maintain those passwords, A, so that they're accurate and get updated as they change, but B, you can revoke access as needed. And what we describe as good collaboration tools when it comes to passwords. Finally, if you have more than one client, organizing passwords on a per client basis and being able to finely control or have fine granular control over who accesses this client versus another client is essential. And for those of you with growing agencies, you're probably working with contractors, being able to give a contractor access to some credentials from one client, but not access to every web password you have, those are critical parts of having good agency security. So there are lots of tools that you can use for this, cloud-based or self-hosted tools. There's a few that I recommend when I was volunteering with the Joomla project. We use something called Team Password Manager, which is still available. And I thought that was excellent. Another one that you can see here is called Passwork. Has a self-hosted version, which is very attractive for open source enthusiasts like myself. This may be overkill if you have a small agency. By using or putting in place a tool like this early, I think it actually helps you grow. Again, builds that corporate policy early, will help you down the road. However, I use 1Password for my own personal password management. I keep it separate from my work passwords. And we use LastPass, and it's got sharing and collaboration tools built into that. So all of those are good options, and you should really review features and figure out the one that works best for you. So just setting the password and organizing them is one thing. You also need good password policies. So those policies generally revolve around how strong will your passwords be and what frequency will those passwords change. So at my bank, for instance, I have to change my password every 3 months. For my client sites, we usually have them change their password every 18 months, depending on the site. Password strength policies are pretty easy. Pretty easy to think about. How complex you want to get them really depends on how your users are using the site. If you have users who never log in or are not very tech savvy, you may not be able to give them an 18 or a 24 character password with a lot of symbols. So you may have to come up with a policy that suits your clients. But if you decide, for example, that you're going to have a 12 character password with 2 symbols and 2 numbers, and you might rotate these annually, for example, those are things that you need to consider in your corporate policy. One thing I can definitely recommend against is putting your passwords in something like a shared spreadsheet on Google. I don't know how many clients have sent me this sort of thing or how many contractors have asked me for passwords in a spreadsheet. You can delete passwords in a spreadsheet, which is fine, but they never really go away. And you can see here in this little GIF that, Google Sheets, for example, stores versions of everything you do. So you can easily, if someone had access to your email, they could easily go back and pull out these credentials, maybe for a client that you don't even have anymore. Okay, so not only should you not store passwords in something like a shared spreadsheet, but also you need a policy for deleting passwords when you and your client part ways. All right, so that will give you, if you have a documented audit of your password system, what part of your maybe termination workflow with the client is to send him an audit saying, we have had these passwords on your behalf. Now that we're no longer in business together, here is your audit showing these passwords have been deleted, removed from our systems, and then you give the client confidence if they have problems later that you're kind of out of the picture. So I think those are also important depending on how much client turnover you have. Another important agency issue, of course, is team management. The trust given to you by your clients extends to your entire team. So it's important that you choose your colleagues and your partners and your contractors with care. It's really easy these days to hire someone you've never met in a country a long way from where you live and have them do work for you. If you're sharing credentials with them, you may be at risk, and you may have to explain to your clients later why their passwords have been sent to some far off land without their knowledge. If you are doing that and you have the right tools in place to properly track and manage these passwords, then it's a good idea to have in your agency policies to inform the clients that their passwords are going to be used in a certain way by certain people. Okay, so keep those things in mind when you're dealing with people that you're not physically working with on a local basis if you're doing that day to day. The other important thing that we can overlook easily is access to shared resources. Especially these days, many people are using Google Docs or Google Drive or some similar type shared file and document editing system. And what we've done for our agency is to basically ensure that everyone, including contractors, uses a corporate email system for accessing their files. Okay, everyone that I work with gets a company email. Whether or not they use that day to day to send emails to me, for example, that's not really required. But if they want access to our Google Drive, they have to log in with their email to get access and to see the other things that we're sharing with them in order to make the project go forward. Again, when you're using contractors, it's very important. But even if you have somebody who's working locally, if there's a problem, they leave the company, they get disgruntled, you don't want them to just kind of be able to come in with no access. You'd like to be able to change that access very easily by controlling the email account. I mentioned Google Drive a few times. Here's a screenshot of the link sharing screen when you have data stored in Google Drive and you have numerous options. This is actually from Watchful, as you can see there highlighted. So if you work at Watchful, you can't access our Google Drive unless you're using your Watchful email account, and the files that are in there can't be shared outside of the organization. You can't obviously prevent people from printing things off if that's what they want to do, but making things more secure by limiting the access and controlling the access is important. Finally, if a person leaves your organization, having them on your corporate email system, whether it be Drive or Microsoft or anything, being able to transfer the ownership of their documents to another user when you have staff turnover is also a great feature that you want to keep in mind as you're going forward. The other real important agency feature by making sure everyone is using their own credentials is that you can do forensic user logging and find out who is doing what with what account. So if you're sharing your passwords like you do on iTunes or Netflix, which might be fine, You really can't do better than having individual access points for your staff so that you can find out who's doing what should something go wrong. So strongly recommend, if you're using, for instance, in the Joomla world, it's common that you might have one shared password so everyone in your agency can log into the backend. I strongly recommend against that. Have individual email accounts so you can track people, not just on your sites, but in your agency for the things that they're doing. Another item that's easy to overlook, especially when you're starting out, is a disaster response plan. The best agencies need to be prepared for any number of emergencies. These might be denial of service attacks, a system-wide outage, hacked site, natural disaster, or maybe a serious illness, or maybe even the death of a team member who's working on a project. While those are terrible things, your clients are counting on you to have a plan in place to make sure that services can still be delivered and things still work normally for them, even though you might be going through, your company might be going through, one of these kind of disasters. Okay, so there are a few things you need to keep in mind. You need to know who will do what and when. So when a disaster happens, what's the first step? Who's doing it? Who's responsible? For example, you may work in a place where there's an email chain. If there's an emergency, there's 5 people, contact 5 more people each, and then you can let the whole company know pretty quickly. Also, what's the emergency contact information for everyone on your team? Are you able to reach them in an emergency if it's late at night, for example? What's the contact information for your clients? Say you have an outage and all your websites are down. Can you easily email or otherwise contact all your clients at once to say, hey, there's a problem, we're working on it, don't worry, we'll give you an update soon. It's important to have that ready and not be scrambling for that when you're wondering how you're going to get your websites or your web server back up. Other important information you need for your disaster plan, your service provider info, so your DNS provider, your hosting provider, maybe your data center credentials or access to your data center, and where your redundant backups are stored and how to get access to them if you need to do restore from a backup. Finally, 2-factor authentication is everywhere these days, and they all come with one-time use passwords. You should have those stored safely, but readily available if you need to get into a system and maybe you can't generate password with your authentication tool, your software, or your phone. Those one-time passwords will really be handy if you have them on hand. Ongoing education is another issue that as your company grows, you're going to want to start thinking about. You want to regularly schedule security-related talks and conferences for your staff, annual compliance reviews and policy refreshers so people know what the security policies are in your company or that you're telling your clients, that you're verifying with your clients that you're following. Means testing to determine weaknesses is also important. For example, 91% of targeted attacks involve phishing emails. So how do you know if your contractors or your staff are aware of phishing emails? Your web developers probably are, but maybe your admin people are not. Your administrative assistants, maybe they're not thinking about phishing emails. You can use something like Phishing Box, which is a tool where phishing emails are sent out to your staff, and then Phishing Box in this case will monitor how many people actually click through those emails. These are not real, of course, phishing emails. They're just meant to track how easily people can be fooled in your agency. You then follow up with your staff on how many people click through and follow up with the appropriate education to make sure people are thinking about security and putting security first when they're working for you and on behalf of your clients. So if you put all these things together, you end up with a nice security policy that outlines all the things your agency is doing to earn and maintain the trust of your clients. So that includes email usage, resource access, password strength and duration, account sharing policies, team composition and location perhaps, disaster planning and continuing education. By formalizing all of these things, you can actually build this into your sales policy and say, hey, if someone's trying to decide between you and another agency, this could be the factor just that you're going to help earn their trust during the sales process and give them confidence to choose you as a vendor. Especially if you're working in nonprofit or government sector, having a good security policy can go a long way. Okay, so that's the agency. I spoke quite a bit about that. I'm passionate about that area. But as web builders and developers, we're all interested in the technical side of things also. And when it comes to servers and services, I like to break it down into local resources and remote resources. So I'm going to deal with the local ones first. And the obvious items here are your LAMP stack or whatever stack you're using. LAMP is a common one, of course. It's the core of all the servers you're generally distributing, say Joomla on, so Linux, Apache Webserver, MySQL, or some other SQL database, and then PHP, of course, because that's the language that Joomla is written on. So keeping an eye on vulnerabilities, of course, in these areas is critically important. We often outsource these to our service providers, and I'll just take PHP as an example. I certainly know many developers who don't give a lot of attention to PHP version, but it's very important. You can see here I'm comparing Joomla and WordPress version usage for PHP. And on the left, you've got version 7.1 plus. That's the oldest supported version of PHP. PHP 7 is not supported no longer. And of course, the 5.2 to 5.6 series have long been obsolete. You can see that, a good majority, almost 75% of Joomla sites from the public usage statistics available are still running older, perhaps vulnerable versions of PHP. We're hoping that many hosts have live patched these older versions, which is fine. But to be the safest, you want to be using version 7.1 or greater. 7.1 is soon going to be it'll soon be end of life. So you'll be looking to get at version 7.2 recently. And this is something you can talk to your IT department about or your hosting provider, especially if you're using something like Cloud Linux. Switching between different PHP versions tends to be pretty trivial these days. Whether or not your plugins are all compatible with that, that's another question. But the actual mechanics of getting it done on your server, if you have cPanel, for example, can be pretty straightforward. But it's the follow-up work, making sure that things are still working properly when you do an upgrade to PHP. That's the real, generally more time-consuming part. Apache, of course, is a very common web server. A lot of people are also using Nginx these days. And I'm going to bring up just a very old vulnerability. And it's in an Apache module called OpenSSL. So SSL is what allows your websites to have the green lockup in the browser, an HTTPS site versus an HTTP site. So if you're, for instance, buying something online, you don't want your credit card information transmitted over the internet where someone could sniff the data or pull the data out of a server log. You want that to be encrypted end to end so that you can have confidence in that your data will be secure. And so OpenSSL is the module that supports that. And a while back, 2014 even, OpenSSL had a very serious security bug called Heartbleed. And this was all over. I mean, this was on CNN. It was everywhere. It was a massively discussed and covered story for good reason. It was handling essentially all of the encrypted data online, in particular for e-commerce. So this was, because it was such a big deal was made about it, a lot of companies patched it. There were services where you could check whether or not you had that problem on your server. Mostly everyone's forgotten about it now, but just to let you know, just in 2019, there have been 6 low-level security issues patched in OpenSSL. OpenSSL is still a primary cryptographic tool used on the web. And so you need to make sure that your server is running good version of OpenSSL that's been patched. You can go to sslabs.com, check your domain. Here you can see that joomla.org gets an A rating. Could be getting an A+, but this is generally considered pretty good. So you want to make sure that your servers are showing a similar result. And if not, you contact your hosting provider or your IT department to find out what's going on, okay? And just as a shout out, if you're not using Let's Encrypt for your SSL certificates, then I highly, highly recommend it. We, for many years at Watchful, for instance, have used expensive third-party certificates. And essentially, we don't need that kind of old school certificate anymore. And so we're just migrating everything to Let's Encrypt. And all of our web clients now are simply using Let's Encrypt. It's free and it's phenomenal. So definitely check that out if you have not already. So other local issues, just to list off some to keep in mind, make sure that you're using your terminal, your SSH on a non-default port, and you're using encryption keys to make sure the right person is trying to get into your terminal. Disable FTP altogether. Make sure people are using SFTP instead. You definitely want strong database passwords, and my recommendation is that every client gets its own database table with database user with separate unique credentials, so that if one person gets hacked, for example, it doesn't affect your other clients as easily. Logging at the server level is also very important. Many hosts will disable this by default, when you get a new hosting account. So if you are purchasing shared hosting, for example, make sure you go into cPanel if that's what you're using, if not contact support, and make sure that you've turned on logging. What is very common is you get a problem, some security issue, you contact the hosting company and ask them about, can you check the logs? And they say, oh, well, logging was disabled. We've just turned it on for you. Well, that's okay, but once the event has happened, turning on logging doesn't actually help you. You need the logging to be occurring the whole time so you can go back, figure out what the attack vector was, and make sure it's patched and doesn't happen again. So definitely, I can't stress enough, enable logging. I put these two at the end, magic quotes and registered globals. These are kind of old school vulnerabilities that you really don't see in the wild that often these days. So. Okay, so in addition to our what I call local issues at the server level, we also have remote items to talk about. And these are the other services that you use to deliver a website. And a modern website uses many modern services these days. So for example, I advise most people now to not run their own mail server. Okay, having a mail server, especially on the same server as your website, really just puts extra load on your server, for one. It's another thing you have to manage, and it makes it a larger target for hackers. Many hackers want to get access to a server so they can send out and send spam emails from IP addresses that they don't own and can't be traced to. So by just offloading the email server to a third party like SendGrid or Elastic Email, that's a real easy way to offload some of that work and improve, I think, the security of your site. DNS server is also important. To your DNS service provider, rather. Many folks do this right in cPanel. They manage DNS there. The problem with that, of course, is if you have a problem with your server, it's been attacked or it goes down, then you can't manage your DNS very easily. So I definitely recommend a third party for that. We've used Cloudflare, used Amazon Web Services. Normally, a registrar will have a DNS management panel, but the propagation for a typical registrar is still 2 to 8 hours in our experience. If you use something like Cloudflare to manage your DNS records, you can have essentially instantaneous changes. So you need to redirect a site that's being attacked with a denial of service, for example. You can have an immediate response using a third-party DNS service provider. The other remote services we recommend is a reverse proxy. We mentioned Cloudflare again. I can't really say enough about Cloudflare. They offer a really great free service. Reverse proxy, really what we use it for primarily is for real-time firewall protections. Those apply to all requests to your website. So before your web server is even processing, maybe a malicious request, oftentimes most of the time, a good reverse proxy will take care of that for you, and they'll block the request. Okay. They also speed your site up generally, really great caching. They're a CDN, Cloudflare is anyway. So using a reverse proxy as a remote service is really superb. So if you haven't yet checked out Cloudflare, jump in there and you can get a free tier for your site. And I have no financial relationship with them, but they're just superb. So give them a look. Okay, well, we'll end our talk today talking about the sites and software that you actually deliver to your clients. So this is usually your Joomla site, right, and the extensions that you run on it. There are a number of well-known best practices. I've listed some of them here. You want a unique administrator account. So as soon as you create a user in Joomla, as soon as you log in the first time, make a new super user account, delete the original one, the admin one that comes with Joomla, and get rid of that default one. This will improve security for sure. Disable guest registration unless you really need it. Usually now the Joomla installation directory gets moved during installation. You want to make sure that's not kicking around. Don't store your FTP passwords in your configuration files. And you definitely want to disable error reporting of your website so that people aren't seeing which softwares and which lines might have problems. That's going to give them insight into your server. You definitely don't want that. There are a number of tools which offer best practice scanners, for example. I'm partial to one of these, of course. And so here's just a quick little screenshot of our best practice scanner. And you can see that in this case, the configuration file has been modified and K2 comments are open. There's a few things I need to check here, and then there are like 20 items that we consider following what we consider best practice policy. So if you're using tools like that, definitely look at your best practices and keep an eye on those. And then, of course, once you've got your site up and running and hardened the way you like, you're going to want to think about how you're going to manage passwords. And a lot of the advice here is similar to what we discussed earlier for your agency, right? You need to think carefully about who you're giving access to and how complex their password can be versus how savvy the user is, and will a really complex password prevent them from using the site? I've certainly had that with my clients. They're not using password managers, and it's difficult for them with a complex password. So in the last few years, Joomla has really done a lot of work on the password side, and you can see here the password options in the Joomla backend. You can set minimum length, how many integers and symbols and uppercase characters you need, and even how many password resets you can do, and the time that those reset requests expire. Okay, so this is really great improvement in Joomla in the last few years. And if your people are logging in for the first time, maybe you're creating accounts for them, you can make them change their password on the first login. And so if you're, for instance, emailing them a password, that's a pretty insecure way to distribute passwords. But if you've enabled change on first login here in the password option, then you know that password can only be used that one time, very likely by that user, and then they have to change it right away. So consider that also. Password expiry is not built into Joomla core, but there are extensions like user password policy, which will allow you to set an expiry date for passwords. And if you recognize this screen, you may realize that Joomla by default sends out plain text passwords. So this is the text you get when a new account has been created. Of course, they include your username and password. The administrator is setting it up for them. You can now disable that in the backend options for our users, as you can see here, and determine whether or not you should send that password, right? And generally, you should try to avoid sending passwords on email if you can. So other site tips: use a software firewall in addition to a DNS level firewall. Admin tools and RS firewall, of course, are popular choices. We like to always protect the admin areas with a password or a token. Additionally, many of the DNS level firewalls, like Cloudflare, will allow you to only access sites via IP. Of course, admin tools does that also, but they go a step further and can identify bots that might be trying to identify your admin area. And even if they have the token, can still block them. So I recommend that. If you're building an e-commerce site, do not collect credit card data. Okay, it doesn't have to be unique. Could be just a form where people are paying invoices, with for instance, RS form with a Stripe plugin. Do not store passwords directly. Make sure that some third-party specific credit card processor like Stripe, for example, is doing that information, so that if you do get hacked, there's nothing in there that is going to financially impact the people who submitted their card data. Like the agency passwords or the agency account access, don't share user accounts for Joomla. If you have 10 people who log into the back end of Joomla, don't give them a shared account. While that's easy, it makes it very difficult to do follow-ups and follow who's doing what, including where the data is being logged. So the user logging now that's built into the Joomla core is really helpful for this. If you have one account per person, then you can easily follow along and see who's doing what in the back end of a site. Again, this might be a situation where you are doing some forensic analysis after an event and trying to figure out who caused the problem and who did what. So the user actions log is another great, really recent feature in Joomla. Of course, I can't talk enough about applying updates early and often. This is a screenshot from the Joomla updater in the Joomla backend. This is the easiest, I guess you'd say, and best way to protect against most attack vectors is to keep your Joomla site updated, both the core and the plugins. Okay, and so Joomla has made great strides here, as you can see, also with plugin updates. If you're doing multiple site updates, of course, think about a management tool that allows you to do lots of updates, maybe even do auto updates. That's a feature we just released recently, Watchful. If you trust vendors that their software can be auto updated, that is going to go a long way for security. Well, that's all I've got for my talk. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. If you'd like to reach out, feel free to follow me on Twitter. I'm best accessed on email, so drop me a note whenever you'd like. Thanks for your patience and for attending this webinar.
Wonderful. Thanks, Vic. I'm going to open it up to questions now. One that we have is protecting the Joomla admin area. Do you have any recommendations for perhaps extensions or plugins or HD access tools or Cloudflare? How do you go about protecting the admin area on your Joomla sites?
Yeah, so this is what I use personally for my sites. And so we have a multi-layered approach. We use admin tools, which allows us to add a token to the URL so that it's not just administrator, it's administrator, / token. So that way, as soon as if a bot comes to your website and tries to access directly, it's not going to find the login and it's going to go somewhere else just because it can't find the token. It's going to get a 404, and that's not what it expects. That's not what bots expect to find. So that discourages them right away. So that's one. The other one is that we protect those areas using Cloudflare, and you can put in access rules for your administrator login. So we have both those working hand in hand. So admin tools plus Cloudflare to basically double protect the backend. Those are the things that I recommend. There are some tools, for instance, for the token part, it's a plugin that only does that just obscures or just adds a token to the admin. So if you don't want to use a full web application firewall like admin tools or like RS firewall, you can look for just those. So you can Google search for things that hiding the admin. If you want a smaller tool, those are available, but I recommend admin tools and Cloudflare together. We use those both on Joomla sites, of course, and WordPress. They work the same way.
Okay. Do you have any specific recommendations about two-factor authentication on Joomla sites? Do you use the Google Authenticator or the YubiKey, or do you find it too cumbersome?
For me personally, I find it too cumbersome. Our clients that are not, so we use it at Watchful for accessing Watchful itself. But for our client sites that we build for like a regular web development agency, mostly we're finding that unless they're healthcare related or finance related, we don't use two-factor on the back end. Of course, it supports it, and then you use whichever one you like, YubiKey or Google Auth. But normally for our clients, they're not in there enough. And also, we don't, as a policy, we never give super user access to our clients. Usually there are managers in the back end, and we use Joomla's ACL tools, access control tools, to give them access to what they need to. So it's a better experience, but it's also a little bit safer. That's how we feel about it. But some places need that. Again, we have a couple financial clients, and they have to have it. But then they're in a highly secure environment. They know all about two-factor authentication. For that audience, makes a lot of sense.
Okay, this is an interesting question. It's almost an internal Joomla question. Question in the chat is, do you have any recommendations for keeping like PDFs and documents safe for particular users inside a Joomla site? So imagine you're an agency, you've got multiple clients, and you've got a website set up for your business. Do you have any recommendations for giving different users access to different documents on your site, perhaps with a password protected folder or a user group protected folder?
We don't usually use basic Apache authentication for protecting files. We would use a dedicated file management tool for that. So either an extension, and I don't have a specific recommendation on a Joomla download manager. Steve, you probably have a few, as my guess. But I would use a dedicated tool for that, because those are designed to obscure direct linking and direct file paths and things like that. So that's what I would I wouldn't necessarily use Apache's authentication tools to deliver files, unless maybe there was only one. If it's only one file, maybe. But if you're going to be doing it on a regular basis, my recommendation is a dedicated tool for that. We often will use Amazon for distributing our files. And so we use the authentication tools inside Amazon Web Services for such things. So even though we have the link on our site, it's actually all managed in Amazon Web Services. So depending on where your infrastructure is, you might have some tools for that also. Dropbox, for example.
I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Joomla Shack has a downloads extension that can do this called OS Downloads. There's also a bunch of good alternatives. The Joomla Tools team have Docman, which is good. Foca downloads. Using an extension like that is probably the way to go, I think, there.
Dedicated extension for sure.
Question from Anne. Automatic updates always make me nervous about having sites break. Is that not a concern? I think I know the answer to that being yes, definitely. So what do you say to people who are nervous about automatic updates?
Yeah, what I say to generally is you need backups. So that almost anything you can break with an auto update, you can fix pretty easily with a backup. And if you're using Akiba, you can restore an Akiba site, I want to say in 90 seconds. So the downtime is very low. The question is, what kind of monitoring are you doing to make sure your site is staying up and that it's online and functioning the way you want? I don't think we're quite there yet for Joomla. I think we're getting closer. WordPress is getting there very quick. Well, I should say very quickly. It's getting there in a larger way, meaning more plugins are starting to offer auto updates. WordPress itself auto updates the core. So yeah, I think we're getting there. We're not quite there yet. Right now, for myself, I only choose auto updates for a few select vendors, or maybe something in the back end that's kind of, maybe I have a Google Analytics plugin in the back end or something that's pulling in some Google Analytics data, something that's I wouldn't consider necessarily critical to what I'm doing. But no matter what, you need, if you're going to be doing updates, even if you're doing them manually, you need some way to make sure your site is still operating. So I think the question is more not, are auto updates safe? It's more, do you have an infrastructure in place to make sure your site is working after any kind of update? So jury's still out, I would say, on that.
We had a talk yesterday from George Wilson from the Joomla team, and he said that they had been talking with Google about infrastructure and about ways to bring automatic security updates to Joomla 4. So although it's like a watchful feature now, automatic updates could well become a Joomla core feature in the future. And I'm sure they will be opt-out, but they'll be available to people that want it.
Yeah, I think it's the way to go. I mean, my phone, my computer, I have auto updates installed on all of that stuff. So hopefully our websites get there in the next couple of years. I definitely see it as a major growth opportunity for all of these CMSs. It also depends on how you build your sites. If you're building really complicated things on the front end, that depending on how you've integrated it and how you built it, it may be very sensitive to auto updates. So one of the things that I know with my clients is that on the client side is that some sites I can easily auto update everything and it's no problem. Others I have to be a little more careful with. And so at least for the watchful side, we built it to be flexible. People could make that decision either per extension or per site or a mix of per site and per extension, so that people are going to go forward with the, as they're carefully and as their confidence increases.
Okay. Interesting question from Emerson here. Are there any alternatives to Akiba backup on Joomla sites? Or is that really the only tool available for backup and restoring sites?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There are lots of third-party backup tools outside the Joomla ecosystem that are not dependent on any particular software, CMS, for example. So if you're considering something like that, just look for website backup, and you're going to find many tools like that. You can even homebrew some tools where you can use a tool called rsync to back up your files and databases. And there are tools that also operate at the server level. And we've been thinking about moving to some of them internally because they're a little bit easier to manage. And so you get basically a backup dashboard where you can just restore one site or one database versus everything, but you're not managing, for instance, connecting all your websites individually to Akiba. If you're doing offsite backups with Akiba, every site needs to be manually connected to the offsite provider, maybe Amazon S3, for example, or Backblaze. It can be a little tedious, and if you have hundreds of sites, it's very tedious. So having a server-level backup solution can make a lot of sense in those cases. Also, if I'm not mistaken, the most recent versions of cPanel also have their own backup, and you can schedule daily backups in cPanel and handle it all, again, outside of Joomla. In terms of Joomla plugins, I have not had, we manage tens of thousands of sites at Watchful. We've had no interest in any other, we've had no one contact us and say, please support this backup plugin. So I think for all intents and purposes, they've kind of cornered the market.
So if people have more questions, they can follow you on Twitter or send you an email?
Absolutely. I'm always looking to chat. Email's the best for me, but I am on Twitter occasionally also.
Well, thank you so much, Vic.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the conference.